Telegraph has revealed today that staff working from home delayed HS2 by as much as a year, according to a top planning official. Nick Smallwood, Chief Executive of the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, told MPs that the rise of remote working has delayed design work on a range of major infrastructure projects, including HS2. Sharing the blame with remote working is planning red tape, optimism bias, whatever that is, unexpectedly bad ground conditions, and the soaring costs of labour and materials. In other words, they made a right hash of it. Joining me down the line is writer for The Spectator and academic Professor Andrew Tettenborn. Good evening, Andrew. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Mike.
Not at all. Now, I've got a great piece of yours here about the Rwanda judgment, which we'll get to in a moment. But I've had a bee in my bonnet about working from home for a very long time. I don't believe, I refuse to believe consistently anybody that tells me, oh, I do a lot more work when I'm at home. I find myself able to do so much more because I don't have the distractions of being in the office. I don't have to spend time commuting. And I just don't believe them. I fail to see how anybody working away from everybody else in an organisation is better than working with them.
Yeah, I'm rather with you, actually, there. There are some jobs which you can do at home. Writing op-eds for The Spectator, I suppose, is one of them. But there are a great many where you do actually need to be round the water cooler or round the coffee machine.
Yes.
That includes, in particular, design. Because if you've got a bunch of guys designing HS2, they've got to be able to bounce ideas off each other, knock on each other's doors, walk into each other's offices. It simply doesn't do any good to say, oh, well, you know, email your plans to somebody else and hope they're there and hope you get some sort of response back in a few minutes.
Yes.
Things simply don't work that way. And that's true with an awful lot of things, you know, designing new products. Perhaps that's why we're so bad at that. You've got, again, to have people actually present rather than people withdrawing into their own cells.
Yes.
What you really got here, actually, there's another very interesting feature. This is one of the unintended consequences of lockdown.
Yeah.
And, you know, memo to Lady Hallett on the lockdown inquiry, though she won't take any notice of it. But one of the difficulties of encouraging everybody to go home and work from home is they ought to have foreseen it was going to be very, very difficult to get them back at the end of it.
Right.
And somebody ought to have realised that we're going to have a major campaign to get people back.
I mean, it took a long time to get them back to the place where it is now, which is still not full kind of everybody's back at work. But there's a lot more people now back. I mean, London, the centre of London is now, because I worked all the way through every single lockdown there was. And it was quite...
The Home Office is one of the most empty places.
Yeah. Well, we found out today from another piece of the Telegraph that there's only an average working week in the office is 1 day. Yeah, you know, which normally they spend having sort of seminars about how to write she, her on the end of your email, and whether you've got some kind of diversity shoes on so that you're walking in the right way.
Oh, that's right. Well, actually, that's very interesting. If you look at some of the websites that mention HS2, you'll see they have all sorts of things like menopause support groups, the Net Zero Network. I certainly remember reading about today when I was looking up. There are all sorts of exciting things to do if you do get into the office there. What they don't seem to include is designing railways.
Well, this is the thing, and one of the questions that you would have if you were involved in the HS2 project would be, what the bloody hell are you doing? Why haven't you done anything for 2 years? Why haven't you built the railway? Why do you have a project which has no trains, no railway, and effectively just a load of property that you seem to have bought, and you're buying things in from companies which are costing about 4 times the average price that you could get them anywhere else? You know, those are questions which nobody's being asked.
I know you're absolutely right. Productivity generally in Britain is dreadful, and unfortunately, that's one of the things that we're very bad at dealing with. And I think in the public sector and the semi-public sector, productivity is probably worse than anywhere else, or almost worse than anywhere else. And HS2 is no exception.
It really is dreadful. How about this from a piece in the Telegraph about the Home Office? Senior staff hold events on Black History Month, Windrush and microaggressions. We are told to attend quarterly away days, usually held online. Most of us are in the office just one day a week, where we are given prizes and are told by senior civil servants just how wrong any political or press criticism of our work is. It's like a cult, it's become.
Oh, it is. Oh, tell me about it. Some universities are as bad as that. But unfortunately, it's one of these cults that's spreading. And one thing the government might think about is saying to every public department, get rid of or redeploy 50% of all your EDI guys.
Yeah. I know, incredible. Let's just, before I let you go, Andrew, talk about the piece you've written today for the Spectator. The Rwanda judgment, you say, was not a foregone conclusion, and you're not one of those who believes that this is the end of the road, and it's certainly not necessarily the case that the Court of Appeal, or rather the Supreme Court, rather, has not made a political decision here. I believe they have.
Oh, the Supreme Court certainly had a choice which to go. They could have said, for example, we regard the Home Secretary's decision, she being an elected politician, as to be given vastly more weight than most other things. It actually said the opposite. If you look at that judgment, for example, it rather dismisses the view of the elected Home Secretary, but the person there all over is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN apparatchik who's made it quite clear that he detests the whole idea of ever sending any refugee anywhere else to have their case decided. But they say, oh, well, you know, this chap is terribly eminent. He's elected by the General Assembly of the UN. All his opinions demand the most enormous respect, and so on. The comparison between the attitude of the Supreme Court, and I think this is ingrained in lawyers, unfortunately. I don't say they're acting in bad faith, but the comparison between the attitude to the elected Home Secretary and the unelected man who does not even come from this country and whose opinion ought to be given the greater weight is actually very telling indeed.
No, I think that's absolutely right. But there does seem to be a real kind of problem at the heart of all organisations in this country, particularly public sector ones, in which they seem to be remarkably inefficient. The only thing they're really good at is kind of hurling barbs at one another. You know, the way that Suella Braverman is now attacking Rishi Sunak is what the Tories have got a good name for, but not much else, really.
I'm afraid that's right. And also, of course, what the public sector is very good at is saying not so much computer says no, but human rights say no. Now, Rishi Sunak has actually started out, at least today, by saying, well, I want emergency legislation, which presumably will apply despite the European Convention on Human Rights. And it's high time he said that, because he's getting a reputation as the man who can't say boo to a Strasbourg goose.
Right.
If he actually does grow a spine and say what matters is what the British people want, and I think there was a YouGov poll yesterday, or so I read, which said something like 48% of all respondents did back the Rwanda scheme. If he was to grow a spine and say, I'm going to take on the internationalist human rights establishment, I think he'd vastly increase his popularity. That, again, is a very, very heretical view in a university.
Yes. Indeed. And I mean, we are now living, unfortunately, that world that has been created, because Peter Hitchens has been telling me this for years and years and years, that Tony Blair kind of recreated Britain. And we're only now feeling the effects of a lot of it, but where we've got people running police organisations, people running, you know, vast companies which have become ridiculously woke because of the things they learned at university. You know, diversity and inclusion is everything, and actually doing a business and doing the job is nothing.
Oh, you're quite right. Well, not guilty in that as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, me neither.
You're quite right. A great many people in universities do spend a great deal of time teaching that. reading academic papers these days is like wading through warm soup half the time.